Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I've always wanted to come here. I brought my most important collaborator. I'll introduce her towards the end. She's there on the ground. So yeah, I'll just get started. So the title of my talk is "The Basket Contains No Bread: Metabolizing Ecocide in Ukraine's Soils and Grains." So to start, I have a couple of headlines from last summer, summer 2023. This kind of seemed to be a moment where the kind of global media diet stopped having as much of an appetite for images of rubble or bodies or burning landscapes, and sort of started to shift instead to understand the impact of what was happening in Ukraine in how it impacts the rest of the world. So topics of ecocide, climate destruction, and more so for me, I was kind of struck by this concern for this threatened breadbasket of Europe, and sort of this understanding of the kind of interlinked and interrelated sort of metabolic links between what is kind of being exported out of Ukraine and then what is then being digested elsewhere. And even to sort of refer to the term breadbasket itself, it sort of supposes portability, like a container for carrying a basket away from its source of production. And of course, it's not a unique term to describe Ukraine. There are many sort of breadbaskets of the world. And so the last summer, there was a series of infrastructure attacks on grain ports, various infrastructural weaponizations that were sort of aimed at the environment, as well as to sort of explain this kind of ripple effect. And so in kind of thinking through where is that basket, what is that basket, I started to kind of dive a little bit deeper into how we can understand this kind of history, present, and future through an analysis of the geography itself. So what is actually happening to that land? What is being carved into that land? What has been sort of inserted into that land, taken out as a landmass in itself? And so Ukraine is the largest country by landmass within the European continent, and 65% of this arable landmass constitutes 25% of the world's black soil, so translated as chernozem. Over 65% of Ukraine's chernozem are industrially farmed, constituting $27.8 billion in exports and accounting for 41% of the $68 billion of total export value and 25% of the country's GDP. The international valuation of Ukraine is thusly dependent on the fruits of labor which those soils produce. So the whole landmass has sort of been engineered over the last 100 years to extract this value from its territorial extents. And for me, this question of how to understand this lays in two things. How can I understand what's happening on a geopolitical scale, but landing in tangible infrastructure or the ground as infrastructure? Or how does the terrain of Ukraine explain what's been contended? And second, what is that terrain digesting and then feeding to the rest of the world? So these are images from a photographer, Michel Slomka, who's taken aerial photos of where bombs have been dropped throughout different agricultural fields, as well as here we have a bunch of trenches carved within the soil, which kind of oftentimes get carved in these sort of moving patterns, so that if any one area sort of starts to get lit on fire or gets jeopardized, you sort of continue to carve in meandering ways like this. And so, yeah, to understand the soil as a noun, we can understand it as this upper layer of earth in which plants grow. Material consists of a mixture of organic remains or clay or rock particles. Or we can think about it as a verb, something that's a process rather than a noun. For it's a living aggregate of organisms, decomposing, formally living organisms, and fragments of mineral sediment that are in the process of breaking down and then are constantly being transported to lower levels and then getting kind of pulled back up through root systems. The human eye can really understand the land because it exists only in the perceivable fiction of cartographic representation, so maps. So arrangements of lines outlining which is and which isn't within named categories, owned categories, physical or political. But land requires this zoomed out view. So it requires a distance between your eye and the map. It requires air between you and the ground or the soil. But if we dive into it, get a little bit closer, we can sort of start to understand, like, why is this chernozem considered this sort of black gold, which sort of pays for itself in its kind of existence and its aliveness, and the ways that life sort of subsists on its existence. So it attributes this properties of increased fertility to this thickened layer of organic biomatter called humus. And because the winters are cold and the summers are hot, worms and other critters inhabit a wider range of depths, adjusted to fluctuating temperatures, resulting in more bioturbation. So basically worms kind of travel up and down and introduce air pockets and places where water can remain, and water can seep up and down, and everything can sort of fluctuate with the moon cycles and with the sun cycles. And so because of this, less than 1% of Ukraine's agriculture requires irrigation. And that's because of this really gentle slope that allows for this bioturbation to happen. And in process, what's happening is that the soil is always digesting rock and biological material. And then, of course, chemicals, bombs, traumas. And in a way, we're very, very connected to what's happening in our soil. So one of my favorite quotes, it's probably hard to read here, but that every molecule in your body has been through the soil billions of times, and the fact that you yourself are not soil at this moment is only a temporary condition. So I started also kind of trying to understand what actually are we physically carving into those depths of soil. So you saw this photo a few slides back of the trenches, sort of almost as if carving your own tomb. Your own place for a coffin to lay, a space for a body. Bomb shelters underneath all of the buildings as these kind of spaces within the soil. Landmines are currently distributed throughout tons of territory. But historically, we can also understand how carving into the land were some of our first architecture. So whether that's ovens and kilns within the soil, where you could start a fire, excavate some clay from just nearby and then sort of harden it in order to create these watertight structures. Carving dams and reservoirs were some of our first architecture, sort of retaining water, then kind of extrapolating that to create the first structures. Yeah, so basically as soon as agriculture brought a surplus of food and permanent settlement, storage utensils of all kinds were essential. And the shaping of the earth was an integral part of shaping the city and preceded it. That intimate biotechnic relationship is one that modern man, with his plans for replacing complex earth forms and ecological associations with saleable artificial substitutes, disrupts at his peril. That's a quote from Louis Bumper talking about the origin of the city. And so today, in the last 100 years, essentially, along with Stalin's first 5-year plans, was a set of goals for the Soviet economy to prove its effective competition with the individual capitalism that was modernizing the West. So in order to do this, the goal was to basically transform the landmass into an industrial machine itself, which of course then also needed to require the mobilization of tons of engineers to engineer the land, the rivers as dams, as an energy infrastructure, and as grain silos. So basically these vessels that are basically permitting the storage of the production of that land to be processed, simplified into its smallest common denominator, and then sort of brought into these vessels for transport. So down the rivers, down the grain elevators, down the elevators that are on the river itself. And basically, yeah, like subjugate the land for export rather than for what any relationship is in an embodied way. And sometimes I like to think of this as almost like a modern, a really rudimentary form of teleportation, because it requires the largest landmass in order to grow. Then only 3% of the stock of the wheat is actually what you need to transport. So just the kernel. So that's what this kind of cross-section is. That's like containing all of the sort of biological material, either for a piece of wheat to then explode into a new plant elsewhere, or to then get transported into all of the forms of caloric intake for all of these countries that are highlighted in yellow to be consuming in their different forms of bread and all types of wheat production. So the wheat constitutes 50 to 70% of the world's caloric intake. Often monikered as the world's breadbasket, Ukraine is one of the top 3 global exporters of grain, supplying 12% of the wheat consumed around the world. So here's a map of Ukraine showing the series of the 6 dams that contributed to the creation of the sort of export machine. There's also here a series of these kind of small white circles. These were some of the first Neolithic settlements that were sort of formed in these concentric rings. You can see a series of mountain ranges that are sort of explaining how the mountainous regions are sort of more to the east and to the west, but then down to the middle, you sort of have this ability for the rivers to basically be hydrating the soils. So the geomorphology of chernozem gently cascades down the steppe, a slope gradual enough to retain and disperse biological sediment flow from the thick hilly forests beyond the country's political borders, and kind of exiting down into the Black Sea. So looking at one of the kind of examples of ecocide, a very clear example was the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. So here's kind of a cross-section of it. So the Kakhovka Dam is the one furthest south, which was the second one to be built. And it essentially resulted in initially flooding and then later desertification. So it essentially dispersed all of the sediment further down and then depleted the ability for water to sort of function the way that it had. But even with the initial construction of it, a meandering river that initially had a series of fluctuations of flooding and dispersion on kind of a natural cycles, instead ended up flooding tons of historic areas upstream in order to even create this reservoir. And the point of it was to sort of allow for water to be then dispersed to the areas further south that weren't naturally getting as much water as the further north chernozem areas. Back here, I had something else to say. So the question is really to understand what then is being dispersed when kind of human-manipulated, deliberate acts of ecocide are being enacted. And so sort of to also understand that it's not just kind of these immediate moments of kind of fast violence, but as I kind of mentioned by starting out by talking about this sort of media diet of sort of relating more to the slow violence of what's been happening, an understanding of kind of our interrelationship to the minerals that are both in soil and in weapons, essentially ammonium and nitrogen. So soil itself is constituted of a lot of ammonium and nitrogen naturally, but also the kind of petrochemicals that Ukraine is actually still dependent on from trade with Russia are ammonium nitrate as petrochemicals. So that's sort of been one of these kind of slow violence that then seeps down into the soils and actually means that for each acre of soil, only 1/3 becomes bioavailable as a result of this sort of artificial petrochemicals being inserted back. And bombs themselves are also primarily made of ammonium nitrate, so these sort of sudden implosions of all of this. And then also humans themselves were made of 3.3% of nitrogen. It comprises the amino acids that make up the proteins and nucleic acids of DNA, enzymes, and hormones. So the sort of interrelationship of what is sort of inside of us that can get weaponized in this artificial and violent ways, it's somehow super profound to me, and I'm not even sure how to fully process it yet. Yeah, we can skip past the timeline. Yeah. So part of the work here is not necessarily to sort of give a super thorough history, but more like to question how we relate to the land that we are on, and its histories and its kind of stories, the decisions that we make based on our value systems of how we then work with it or work against it, allow it to be manipulated, and sort of cultivate it. Because recently, there's a lot of narrative sort of looking more at, as the world warms into an anthropogenic planet, moist and healthy soils operate as a carbon sink, as a heat sink, because healthy soils support diverse microbiomes of bacteria and fungi and collaborate on a cacophony of biological power. And if they're managed correctly, such healthy soils host and proliferate the minerals of other species, including humans, that require for a healthy life. These minerals and waters travel through the root systems, up the stalks of the wheats. The grains become vessels themselves, transporting that very mineral-rich soil profile to the distant lands. But disrupted soils, on the other hand, tilled, depleted, supporting monocrops, end up wasting the majority of their bioavailability while depriving the livelihood of the life surrounding it in situ of where it actually has been growing. And so I've gotten super inspired by this idea of mokosh, the kind of soil earth mother. So that's who's sort of down below the soils here. And they found tons of remains of archaeological evidence of these type of sculptures. So here she is down in the bottom left. The kind of soil, the moist soil mother representing the health of the soil, fertility, eternity, fluidity of life. And the markings themselves, there's tons of different types of them. So I carved my own version of her. Actually, I carved tons of these things. So some of the binoculars, sundials, different things that were made of the earth in order to sort of have talismans that people would disperse throughout the landscapes thousands of years ago in communities that were sort of interrelating in much more sort of localized early agricultural ways. It's not so much to romanticize what, like, a kind of opposition between what that had been versus what we do now, as if there's this like sharp duality, but more so to kind of ask what types of mythologies we could be developing in order to figure out how we can in the future relate to land. So both for what countries do or what different communities do with the land that they find themselves on, but also kind of as a kind of global system. So that piece, that mokosh sculpture, is part of a larger project that I was working on this summer to sort of get out of my head about all the statistics and the sort of like problematization and sort of solutionism that science is essentially aimed at, and trying to understand how can we sort of think through cycles in a more tangible way, think through what soils are doing, and yeah, just to kind of get out of my head a little bit with it. So here she is partying. Yeah, so I'll end with that.